Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Tonight's story is one that could quietly reshape the global balance of power, redraw energy alliances, and expose just how fragile Russia's economic lifelines have become. Russia's $200 million main link to China is gone. The pipelines, the power routes, the strategic energy corridors that Moscow believed would guarantee its survival under sanctions are suddenly under question. And at the center of it all stands one man who has said nothing publicly, but whose silence speaks louder than any speech, Xi Jinping. This is not just about electricity, gas, or money. This is about leverage. This is about dependency. And this is about a moment when China appears to be reminding Russia that partnership does not mean equality. For years, the Kremlin sold a powerful narrative to its people and to the world. Even if the West turns away, Russia will pivot to the East. Even if Europe cuts off gas, China will buy it. Even if sanctions tighten, Beijing will keep Moscow alive. That story was repeated so often that many began to accept it as fact. But now that story is cracking, and the sound of that crack is echoing from Siberia to Beijing. The link that just went dark was not symbolic. It was real money, real power, and real strategic value. Over $200 million in energy infrastructure and supply chains tied directly into China's industrial heart. For Russia, this was not just revenue. It was proof that it still mattered, that it still had options, that it could survive a long economic war with the West. And now that proof is gone. To understand why this matters so much, we need to go back a few years, to the moment when Russia and China declared what they called a friendship without limits. Those words were not chosen lightly. They were meant to terrify Washington, unsettle Brussels, and reassure Moscow. The message was clear. Russia and China would stand together against Western pressure, economically, militarily, and politically. But friendships without limits only exist when both sides benefit equally. And over time, the balance began to tilt. China did not need Russia the way Russia needed China. That is the fundamental truth behind everything happening now. China is the world's manufacturing engine, the largest energy consumer on Earth, and a nation with options. Russia, under sanctions, increasingly had only one major buyer willing to deal at scale. That buyer was China. This gave Beijing something extremely valuable: leverage. At first, China used that leverage quietly. It demanded discounts on Russian oil and gas. It negotiated contracts that favored Chinese companies. It paid in yuan instead of dollars, slowly pulling Russia away from global financial systems and deeper into China's economic orbit. Moscow accepted all of this because it had no real alternative. But energy links are not just about prices. They are about trust, stability, and long-term planning. Russian planners believed that once infrastructure was built, once power lines and pipelines were connected, China would be locked in. They believed the physical reality of steel, concrete, and cables would guarantee demand. That belief was a mistake. When reports began to surface that a major Russian power and energy link to China had been shut down or suspended, many initially dismissed it as temporary. Maintenance, technical issues, seasonal adjustments, that's how these things are usually explained. But this time, the silence from Beijing was different. No reassurance, no immediate clarification, no statement emphasizing continued partnership. Just silence, and in geopolitics, silence is often the loudest signal of all. For Russia, this link represented more than $200 million in value. But the psychological impact was even greater. It shattered the illusion that China would always step in, no matter what. It reminded Moscow that Beijing's loyalty is not ideological. It is transactional. China does not operate on sentiment. It operates on interest. And right now, China's interests are changing. China's economy is under pressure, growth has slowed, domestic energy production has increased, renewable energy investments are accelerating at a pace that is reshaping China's entire power grid. Beijing is thinking decades ahead, not months. It is calculating risk with cold precision. Russia, on the other hand, represents risk. Sanctions are not just Western words on paper. They complicate shipping, insurance, financing, and technology transfers. Every deal with Russia carries potential secondary sanctions, reputational damage, and diplomatic cost. For China, which is already locked in strategic competition with the United States, adding unnecessary risk makes little sense. This does not mean China has suddenly become friendly to the West. It means China is pragmatic. If shutting down or freezing a Russian energy link sends a message to Washington that Beijing is not blindly backing Moscow, that message has value. If it forces Russia to accept even worse terms in future negotiations, that also has value. If it reminds Russia who holds the stronger hand, that may be the greatest value of all. For Moscow, this moment is deeply uncomfortable. The Kremlin has spent years presenting China as a reliable counterweight to the West. Russian media has portrayed the relationship as one of equals, of mutual respect, of shared destiny. But reality is now intruding on that narrative. When China turns off the switch, Russia has no way to turn it back on. This is the brutal reality of asymmetric partnerships. The side with options controls the outcome, and the implications go far beyond a single link or a single deal. Energy infrastructure is long-term. It shapes planning, budgets, and strategy. If China is willing to suspend or shut down a major connection now, it raises serious questions about future projects. It makes investors nervous. It forces Russian planners to rethink assumptions that were once considered solid. What happens to the next pipeline, the next power corridor, the next multi-billion-dollar agreement? If China can walk away from a $200 million link, nothing is truly guaranteed. Inside Russia, this is triggering quiet panic among elites. Not the kind you see on television, but the kind that shows up in closed meetings and confidential reports. The question they are asking is simple and terrifying. If China cannot be fully trusted, then who can? Europe is gone, at least for now. The United States is an adversary. India buys Russian energy, but at limited scale and with tough negotiations. Africa and smaller markets cannot replace the volumes Russia once sent west. China was supposed to be the answer, and now that answer is uncertain. For Xi Jinping, this move fits perfectly within China's broader strategy. China wants stability, not chaos. It wants a weakened Russia that is dependent, predictable, and compliant, not a desperate Russia that could drag Beijing into unwanted conflicts or crises. By tightening the energy tap, China gains influence without firing a shot. It disciplines its partner without public confrontation. It signals power without provoking immediate backlash. This is classic Chinese statecraft. It also sends a message to other countries watching closely. Partnerships with China are conditional. Benefits flow as long as alignment serves Beijing's interests. When circumstances change, so do the terms. For the global energy market, the shockwaves are already forming. Traders, analysts, and governments are reassessing assumptions. If China is less willing to absorb Russian energy, Russia may be forced to dump supplies elsewhere at even lower prices. That could disrupt markets in Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. At the same time, China's move strengthens its negotiating position with other suppliers. Middle Eastern producers, Central Asian states, and even African exporters now see a China that is willing to walk away. That makes Beijing a tougher, more feared customer. For the West, this moment is quietly significant. It reveals cracks in the so-called anti-Western axis. It shows that pressure works slowly, indirectly, but effectively. Sanctions did not collapse Russia overnight, but they narrowed its options until even its strongest partner began to reconsider. This does not mean China has abandoned Russia. That would be a misunderstanding. China is not cutting ties. It is recalibrating them, and that recalibration favors Beijing, not Moscow. The real danger for Russia is not this single shutdown. It is what comes next. Once dependence is exposed, leverage is used again and again, prices drop, conditions tighten. Political demands increase. Energy becomes a tool of control rather than cooperation. Russia knows this story well. It once used energy the same way against others. Now the roles are reversing, and that may be the most bitter lesson of all. As the lights dim on this $200 million link, a new reality is coming into focus. Russia's pivot to the east was never a partnership of equals. It was a gamble taken under pressure, and like many gambles made in desperation, it is starting to fail. The silence from Beijing continues. The power remains off, and Moscow is left waiting, wondering not just when the energy will flow again, but on what terms, at what cost, and with how much dignity left intact. This is not just an energy story. It is a power story. It is about who decides, who depends, and who ultimately controls the switch. And right now, that switch is firmly in China's hands. Stay with us, because the consequences of this moment are only beginning to unfold.